Do you think you know what war is the most deadly in U.S. history? Well, the answer might surprise you. And in this video, stay tuned and you'll find out. But first, before we begin, if you're watching this video and are a veteran or currently serving as a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, on behalf of all of us at the Facts Illustrated channel and our families, thank you. Beginning with the fifth deadliest war in U.S. history, the Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953. Over 36,000 U.S. service members lost their lives in this conflict. Here on this map, you can see where the Korean Peninsula is located, just like a little appendage off the continent of Asia. What had happened was, prior to World War II and during the war, the Korean Peninsula was ruled by the Japanese Empire. But then, after the Japanese unconditional surrender in World War II, they got kicked out of the peninsula, and the peninsula was split up between the Soviet Union and the U.S. It was up to the Soviet Union and the U.S. to decide what to do with Korea, and they decided to split the country into two, with the 38th parallel being the border. Everything north of the 38th would be North Korea. Everything south, South Korea. As it would turn out, neither North Korea or South Korea was what you could say pleased with this arrangement, and between the years of 1945 and 1950, some 10,000 North and South Korean soldiers were killed in border skirmishes. And then North Korea basically said, alright, enough of this crap. And they just invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950. With 75,000 soldiers. The U.S. was pretty much like, what do you think you're doing? And many in the American government were quite concerned about the spread of communism.
Have you met my American friend, Mr. Harry Truman? He no big deal. You may remember him though. He dropped atom bomb on Japan, like, a couple years ago. You remember? Yeah, him.
The solution? Fight back. By that July, not even a month after North Korea invaded the South, U.S. troops were already fighting on behalf of South Korea. The fighting was intense, and neither side really had much to show except for blood, carnage, and death. The U.S. government tried tirelessly to work out some sort of a truce with the North Koreans, as many feared that the conflict could intensify and expand, leading to war with Russia, China, or both, and possibly a World War III. As it would turn out, just over 3 years after North Korea invaded South Korea, an armistice was agreed to. In all, over 5 million people lost their lives, both civilians and soldiers. Of those casualties, almost 37,000 were American soldiers, making it the fifth deadliest war in U.S. history. The fourth deadliest war in U.S. history, World War I, which the U.S. fought in from 1917 until 1918, causing the deaths of over 53,000 U.S. service members. Tensions in Europe had been rising for some time prior to the start of World War I. The tipping point was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. He was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Governments around the world wondered if the Serbian government was behind the attack, and the intertwining of alliances meant that the events which would ensue would culminate in the deadliest war that the planet had ever seen, at least up until that point. While World War I began in 1914, the U.S. did not want to get involved. Many in the U.S., including many of those in the government, had felt that the conflict was a European affair, and the U.S. officially adopted a policy of neutrality. Germany, however, kept aggressively attacking ships which belonged to neutral countries, namely the U.S. And in May of 1915, a German U-boat sunk the British ocean liner, the Lusitania, which was sailing from New York City to Liverpool, England. It just so happened that there was a plethora of Americans on board, and needless to say, that pissed off pretty much everybody in the U.S.
Y'all gonna pay for this.
Then, in a secret communication sent by German diplomats to Mexico in January of 1917, the Germans proposed Mexico attack the U.S. In exchange,
What's this?
Germany would help them regain the land that Mexico had lost several decades earlier in the Mexican-American War.
You made a bad mistake, mister. Put up your dukes. Come on. Put them up.
It wasn't long after that, on April 2nd, 1917, when President Wilson requested a declaration of war against Germany before a joint session of Congress. And then, 4 days later, after both the House of Representatives and Senate met, both bodies of the government agreed with President Wilson, and the U.S. officially declared war against Germany on April 6, 1917. The first U.S. troops made it by spring 1918. The war was at a stalemate. The first combat by U.S. troops occurring in France warfare in October of that same year, amount of deaths, with little success on either side making much, if any, progress. The exhausted and war-weary Belgian, British, French, and Portuguese forces enthusiastically welcomed the U.S. troops, which were now arriving at the rate of 10,000 per day. The Germans simply couldn't replace their casualties at such a rapid pace, and morale amongst German troops and back in Germany was on the downswing.
Das ist kaputt!
A few long months later, after the deaths of some 9 million soldiers, the war was over with the Treaty of Versailles. The carnage, destruction, and bloodshed caused by the war led some to say that it would be the war to end all wars.
Because of us, there will never be a war quite like this. Ever. Because of us. Hooray! We're all so brilliant!
Whoops. The third deadliest war in U.S. history, the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1964 to 1975, causing the deaths of over 58,000 U.S. service members. Another conflict brought on by fears of communism spreading. Stupid capitalist pigs. This time in Southeast Asia, and the main worry was more so that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeastern Asian countries would soon follow in a theory known as domino theory. Political instability in Vietnam led President Kennedy
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
to increase U.S. aid and the presence of the U.S. military in South Vietnam as a deterrent to those wishing to make Vietnam a full-fledged communist nation.
Oh,
Hello there, Mr. President.
why, hello there.
A couple of years later, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson, with the support of much of the American public, made the decision to send U.S. military forces into combat. As time passed,
Make love, not war.
the war continued with seemingly no end in sight. It became less popular,
Far
and
out,
anti-war
man.
sentiment grew more and more pronounced. In 1973, President Nixon ordered the withdrawal of U.S. forces.
I'm not a crook.
In 1975, Vietnam unified, albeit under communist rule.
Don't.
After all was said and done, the events which led up to the Vietnam War and the war itself spanned the presidencies of 4 U.S. presidents. The deaths of 58,220 U.S. service members makes the Vietnam conflict the third deadliest in U.S. history. The second deadliest, World War II. The U.S. fought in the war from 1941 until 1945, and it claimed the lives of 291,557 U.S. service members. While not the deadliest war in U.S. history, it is the deadliest war in world history. It began in 1939,
Aha!
when Nazi Germany invaded Poland.
Ja, und Blitzkrieg.
From there, the war would spread to practically every corner of the globe and last another 6 years. The events leading up to World War II actually began almost as soon as World War I ended. Remember these guys? World War I was going to be the war to end all wars or something like that.
Hooray!
Right?
Remember? We're
like
really
that?
smart. We're the smart guys. We ended all future wars.
Anyways, as pointed out earlier, the Allies after World War I, in an attempt to prevent such a bloody war from ever occurring again, decided to implement measures which would severely restrict and punish Germany for their
Okay, you
actions.
play nice now, you hear? Yeah, 'cause we ain't fooling neither.
Ultimately, though, this only made the Germans more PO'd and allowed this guy named Hitler to tap into all of that angry resentment, and he was able to literally build a war machine. You see, Germans felt that they had been duped into signing the Treaty of Versailles,
Was?
which forced Germany to pay significant reparations
Das ist nicht gut. Was meinst du?
and even included a war guilt clause, which essentially forced Germany to accept blame for starting the war. When in fact you could argue Austria-Hungary started it. However, they were not forced to sign such a clause. And also, Germany wasn't allowed to join the newly created League of Nations.
Nein.
The feelings of guilt, being duped, and an economy which faltered due in part to the heavy reparations they were being forced to pay basically supplied this really pissed off guy named Adolf Hitler with enough sympathizers and equally pissed off Germans for him to build a cult-like following among his fellow Germans.
Du hast mich. Du hast mich.
The US didn't enter World War II until the Japanese made a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, located in the then US territory of Hawaii. This was where the Pacific Naval Fleet was stationed, and the Japanese feared the US would eventually enter the war, and if they were to have any chance at being victorious, the Japanese pretty much felt that they had to knock out as much of the US Navy as they could. And the best way to do this was with a surprise attack.
Gono baka. Anata wa paka desu. Sensei. Where we wa.
Influential Japanese Admiral Yamamoto is quoted as saying after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." He was spot on. The day after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8th, 1941, Americans were not happy.
Hey, they can't do that.
And the US declared war on Japan. 3 days after the US declared war on Japan, Japan's Axis buddies, Germany and Italy, both responded by declaring war on the US. Now, it was on. The US was basically fighting 2 wars at the same time, one in Europe against Germany and Italy, and one in the Pacific against Japan.
Bring it on.
And as the Allies crept closer and closer to Berlin, Germany's capital, Hitler shot himself! A few days later, Germany officially surrendered on May 8th, 1945. However, the war in the Pacific was still raging on. Now, given the large amount of US casualties that were suffered recently in battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa especially, President Truman realized that a land invasion of Japan had a very high probability of causing the deaths of tens of thousands of US soldiers, possibly, actually probably, even more than that. So, what he did was he authorized the use of the deadliest weapon that the world had seen up to that point.
Whoa, check that out.
It was called the atomic bomb.
Sir, yes, sir.
On August 6, 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb onto the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantaneously killing some 70,000 residents and destroying close to 70% of the city's buildings. 3 days later, the US dropped another atomic bomb, this time over the slightly smaller Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing some 39,000 Japanese and flattening around 40% of the city's buildings. the Japanese initiated negotiations with the US of their unconditional surrender, and formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, and it would prove to be the second deadliest war for the US, causing the deaths of almost 300,000 service members. The deadliest war in US history? The Civil War, which occurred between 1861 and 1865, causing the deaths of almost 500,000 service members. It's important to point out that estimates range quite wildly on the number of deaths caused by the Civil War. Remember, we're using the numbers provided by the U.S. Veterans Affairs. And that 498,000 figure provided by the VA is actually on the low end, as many other data sources have estimates well into the 600,000 and 700,000 range.
Huh?
In addition, if you were a service member during the Civil War, you had a 15% chance of being killed. By far the highest percentage of any war on this list, and the second highest percentage of any war the US has been in. In fact, I was pretty surprised to find out which war you would have had the highest chance of dying in if you were a service member while that war was going on. And just to give you a little hint of which war that was, well, it's not even on this list that we're doing on this video. But if you're interested like I was to find out, check out our other video called The War You Would Have Most Likely Died In. We'll include a link at the end of this video. So, what made the Civil War the most deadly? Why did it have twice as many deaths as the second most deadly war, World War II? Well, there's one big reason for that. In all of the other wars, we were fighting against other nations. In the Civil War, we were fighting against each other. So everyone who died in that war was considered an American, whether they were fighting on the Union side or the Confederate side. Here, you can see how each of the 5 wars compare in terms of the number of total US service members who died in each. The Civil War had almost twice the number of US service member deaths as World War II. It had more than 8 times as many as Vietnam, more than 9 times as many as World War I, and more than 13 times as many as the Korean War. In addition to being the war that has claimed the most lives of US service members, the Civil War also holds dubious honors for several other metrics which further illustrate just how deadly it was. This includes the highest average number of US service member deaths per day at 504. The Battle of Gettysburg, the war's most famous, fought between July 1st and July 3rd of 1863, claimed the lives of over 23,000 Union soldiers and over 28,000 Confederates. That's a total of over 51,000 service member deaths in the span of 3 days at that one battle. That's nearly as many as all of World War I. Whew! The momentum of the war was forever altered in the Union's favor. The 5 deadliest wars in U.S. history. What'd you think? Were you surprised which ones were on it? Maybe you were surprised not to see some on it? If so, let us know by commenting below. And, hold on, don't forget to check out this other video, The War You Would Have Most Likely Died In. Just click here and check it out. And as always, thank you for watching Facts Illustrated.